A really important part of any app is responsive layout. What that means is, let me run the app that we are going to create. It is going to look like this. Right now, we have an app with a couple of items stacked on top of each other. So far, nothing special. However, if I increase the size of this widget, we are at some point getting another kind of layout, and if I go even further, we have a different kind of layout. Which means, depending on the size of the window, we get different kinds of layout. Which is really important because I want the app to look good on basically any size. And some layouts simply don't work on a certain kind of size. For example, if I make this a bit smaller again, this kind of layout here only really works on very small windows. While this one here would only really work on a wide window. So I have to create different kinds of layouts. Now, that being said, implementing all of this in tkinter isn't the easiest thing to do. The reason for that is that tkinter doesn't have inbuilt tools to create responsive layouts, which basically means that we cannot update an existing layout. Instead, what we have to do is we have to create a separate layout for every window size, or at least for the layouts that we want to create. So for this example, I have created 3 different layouts. Let me actually show you. I think that's going to be useful. Here's the code that we are going to create over the course of this video. All the important stuff is inside of the app class. Basically, what you have to understand is that we have 3 methods. One for create small layout, create medium layout, and create large layout. Inside of them, we are simply creating a frame. We are adding widgets to this frame along with the layout method, and then we are packing the frame. Also, before that, we are forgetting the previous frame. That way, if we go from the small layout to the medium layout, we are not creating extra widgets. The really important part of the logic happens inside of another class. This one is called size notifier. What this one is doing is it checks the size of our window, or the width to be more specific. And if we reach a certain threshold, like 300 or 600 or 1200, then this class is going to call the functions we are passing into it, or the methods in this case, which are going to be create small layout, create medium layout, or create large layout. All you really have to understand is that we are creating 3 separate layouts, and we are displaying each layout depending on the minimum size of the window. That's all that's happening here. As a matter of fact, let's talk about it really quick. What we are doing in the most basic sense, we are setting different breaking points for the minimum width of a layout. So for example, if the width of the window is 300, we want to have a small layout. If the width is 600, we want to have the medium layout. And if the width is 1200, we want to have the large layout. And whenever the window resizes, we are checking the width and if the window is crossing a new threshold. If that is the case, we are building a new layout and forgetting the previous layout. That is literally the entire logic, although to implement it, we do need a couple of things. The major difficulty that we actually have to face is in this step here. By default, we can use event binding to check when the window is resizing. The problem is this event is going to run on every resizing of the window, which is a problem for us because we only really want to check if the width crosses a certain threshold. So for example, we want to check if the width of the app crosses 300. We do not care if it goes from 350 to 400. That is completely irrelevant to us. We only care if we go from 299 to 300. That is the major difficulty that we have to implement. The rest is actually fairly simple. But I guess let's jump straight in and let's create all of this. To get started, all I have are the imports for tkinter and ttk. The reason for that is that all of the app is going to be handled by classes. The most important one is the app class. This one has to inherit from tk and tk. Inside of that, I want to call the dunder init method with self, and I also want to have a parameter for the start size. Should be fairly obvious what this one is doing. Inside of the init method, I now want to create a super dunder init method, although this one doesn't need any arguments. Next up, I want to create a title for the app, which I called responsive layout. After that, I want to get the geometry of the app. This one is going to set the starting size. The starting size we are getting from the parameters. This one is supposed to be a tuple with the width and the height. This I have to convert into a string, which I'm doing with an f string. I want to get start size and the index number 0. That is going to be the width. Then I want to do the same thing, so start size, except now I'm getting the first index. This is going to be the height. Once I have that, I want to run self.mainLoop to actually run the app, and this should be all we need to get started. I can now create an instance of this app. So app is app. For the starting size, I went with 400 by 300. If I run this now, we have a basic window. What I now have to figure out is how to get the size of this window when we are resizing it. For that, we need a certain kind of event. Before the main loop, I want to self.bind an event, and the event we're looking for, don't forget the smaller and greater sign, what we're looking for is called configure. This kind of event triggers every time a widget resizes or changes the position. Just to illustrate what's happening, let me pass in a lambda function. Don't forget the event. All I want to do is print the event. If I run this now, you can already see in the bottom, we have an event that is called configure. This event gives us the x and the y position of the window, along with the width and the height. So for example, you can see right now, we have a width and a height of 400 by 300, the exact same thing we have passed into the app. On top of that, if I am resizing the window, you can see we get a different kind of width and height. And if I change the position of the window, we get a different x and y position. But now we do have a tiny bit of a problem, or at least something to be aware of. If I'm resizing the window again, you can see for the width, we get lots of different numbers. Let me try to find a breaking point. What you can see in here, we are running a new event on every change of the window. And I get the width of 977, 988, 999, 1005. And in just a bit, I want to run a function to build a new layout when we are passing a certain kind of threshold. For example, our threshold could be 1000 pixels, which means if we go from 999 to 1005, we want to build a new layout, but only at this point. If we go from 977 to 988, I do not want to build a new layout, which means we have to add some code that we only build a new layout if we are crossing a certain kind of threshold. All of the logic I have put into a separate class. This class I called size notifier. There's no need for inheritance, and in here I want to have a dunder init method. We need self as always. Then I want to have the window, which is going to be the main window, or in our case, this app here. Finally, I want to have what I called a size dictionary. For now, don't worry about it, I'll explain it in just a second. First of all, I want to get self.window as an attribute, which means self.window is going to be window. Next up, I want to turn the size dictionary into an attribute as well. Size dictionary as self is going to be size dictionary. The basic idea is that this size dictionary is going to have key value pairs, like any dictionary. The key is going to be the minimum size of the layout. And then the value is going to be the function that creates this kind of layout. Let me implement it right away, actually. We are going to create an instance of this class inside of the app. We don't have to store it in a variable, so we can just create it straight away. I want to have a size notifier. The window is going to be self. And the size dictionary is going to be a dictionary. I want to have for the key a minimum size, which I set to 300. The associated value is going to be a method. For example, if our minimum width is 300, I want to create a small layout. This one doesn't exist right now, so let me create it right away. I want to create a small layout. We need self and nothing else. For now, so I don't get an error, I'm going to add pass in here. The code we are going to write inside of size notifier really is just going to check if we are crossing this number, and then we are going to call this function. Although, to make this a bit more practical, I want to have two different layouts, at least for now. I want to create one at 300, the small one, and then I want to have at 600 pixels a medium layout. This one doesn't exist right now as well, meaning I have to create medium layout with self and pass. That means inside of the size notifier, if I am printing self.size dictionary, I am getting a dictionary, I don't need the window right now, that has a key of 300, then a method, then another key of 600, and then another method. This is a good start, but I do want to do one more thing. And that is, I want to order this dictionary. Right now, it is already ordered. We are starting from a small number, like 300, and going to a large number, to 600. However, what we could have is a dictionary like this, where we are starting with a larger number. This would be a massive problem later on. So I want to order this dictionary right away. This is actually quite simple. All I need is dictionary comprehension. In here, I want to create a new dictionary with key value pairs. Next up, I need for and key and value in. Now I want the size dictionary and get the items. With this, we would essentially copy the dictionary that we already have. So if I run this, we can't see any difference. To sort all of this, I have to sort what is being returned from these items here. This I can do very easily with the sorted function. Now if I run this, we have a dictionary that is sorted. We can get to the next part. And that is going to be running this event here, or binding it to the window. This I want to do inside of the size notifier. I want to cut it out and paste it in here. Although for this to work, I have to add self.window.bind, because we want to check the size of the window, not the size of this size notifier, which wouldn't work because it's not a widget. And let me clean up the white space a tiny bit, like so. The reason why I want to have this event binding inside of the size notifier is because I want to connect it to a method of this class. The method I called checkSize, or rather self.checkSize, and this is going to be just another method. Important here, we need self and we need the event. Just to check if this is working, I want to print the event. This should already work. If I run this now, we can already see we have one event printed out. If I resize the window, we get lots of events. So things are still working just fine. We could already get started to create different kinds of layout. I guess for now what I could do is I could print small layout for the small layout, and I could print medium layout for the medium layout. So we can see a bit better what's going on. These two methods I can already call quite easily. For example, when I'm checking the size, I could get self.size dictionary with a key of 300, and then don't forget to call it. If I run this now, I get small layout anytime I am changing the layout. This self.size by 300 is going to return this create small layout method. The brackets afterwards are calling this method. Importantly here, when we are passing the method into the other class, we're not calling it, we're just passing the method around, which is totally fine to do. What we now have to figure out is when to call which method. So when do we call the 300 method and when do we call the 600 method? For that, we need a couple of things. First of all, I want to get the window width. This one is really easy because all we need is event.width. Next up, I want to have a variable that tracks which sizes I have already checked. I called this checkSize. By default, the value here is none. Also, let me get rid of this function call here. Now, the logic that I want to implement is for minimum size in self.size dictionary. I want to toggle through all of the minimum sizes inside of this size dictionary. I can print right away what we're getting, minimum size. If I run this now, we get 300 and 600. The way I am going to use this is I want to have the delta size. This is going to be the window width minus the minimum size. And let me print right away what we're getting. We get 100 and minus 200. What these numbers mean is, by default, this window has a width of 400. And we have two breaking points. One at 300, let's say this is roughly here at 300. And we have another point at 600. Let's say this one is broadly here, 600. This delta is going to give us either this distance here or this distance here, which is going to be 100 and minus 200. This information is really useful because all I really have to know is what the smallest positive number is. Once a number goes negative, I know my window size, this point here, doesn't reach the next minimum size. But if the number is positive, I am greater than the smaller minimum size. So in this case, we have two options, 100 and negative 200. This negative 200 tells me that I haven't reached the next minimum size. But since this number here is positive, I know I have exceeded this minimum size, which is this 300 here. And since my window is 400 right now, we're on this point, we know we have reached this minimum size, but not the next one. All I really want to check is if delta is greater or equal than 0. If that is the case, I want to get my checked size and set it to the minimum size. Since delta is becoming negative once we don't reach the next minimum size, this checked size here is going to give us the proper minimum size. There's one thing we still have to do, and that is I want to check if the checked size is different from self.current minimum size. This is an attribute that doesn't exist right now, but I do want to create it. Let me copy it, and inside of the init method, I want to create a current minimum size. By default, this can be none. It doesn't really matter what it is. Also, this should be size. Inside of this if statement, I want to set self.currentMinSize to the checked size. Checked size like so. This if statement here is really important because this one actually tracks if we have a change in our minimum size. Which means in here, we can now run self.size dictionary, and I can pass in self.currentMinimumSize. And this I want to run. Now if I run this, we get small layout, and nothing happens if I just move it a tiny bit. Although if I move it a bit further, we get medium layout. And if I go back to small layout, this is working really well. However, there's one problem already, and that is if I go too far to the left, we get none. The reason for that is if our window is smaller than 300 pixels, we are, well, trying to get the index on this dictionary of a number that doesn't exist. As a consequence, this one here is going to throw an error. The best way around that I found is to set a minimum size that is as large as the smallest size here. So in our case, I want to set the minimum size of the window to 300. That way, we can never have a smaller layout than the smallest layout. That is quite easily added here. I'm going to do this inside of the init method. I want to get a minimum height, and I want to get a minimum width. The minimum width is actually the easier bit, for the simple reason that I already have my self.size dictionary, and I only want to get the first key from it. For that, I have to turn the entire dictionary into a list. On this list, I want to get the first item. That is literally all we need. So next up, we have to work on the height. For the height, I simply want to copy what we are getting when we are creating the app. In my case, that is going to be 300. One way to get that is, first of all, I want to get the window, or to be a bit more consistent, self.window. Although in this case, window and self.window refer to the same object, it doesn't matter which one you choose. This one has a method called winfo_width. This is a method, so don't forget to call it. Although, let me print it right away, minimum height, and well, let's see what we get. We are getting 1, and that is going to be a bit weird. We know that the minimum height of the app when we are starting it is going to be 300. So why is this minimum height going to give us 1? That is very strange. The reason for that is that Tkinter can be a tiny bit weird. So when it creates and when it places a layout, there's a tiny bit of delay. At this point here, when we are creating the size notifier, we have created the widgets, but we haven't placed them properly yet. As a consequence, the size of the app is going to be 1. To account for that, we have to call self.update. This is going to put everything in place, and afterwards you can call the winfo.width or height, and then you get the proper numbers. So if I run this now, we are getting an error because size notifier doesn't have an update method. Instead, what we need is self.window.update. Now if I run this, we are getting 400. And I just realized that is the width, not the height. I typed in width, this should be height. Like so. Now if I run this, we get 300. That is much better. Sorry about that. With that, I can get rid of the print statement here. And once I have these two numbers, all I have to do is get self.window and set a minimum size. The minimum size here is going to be the minimum width and the minimum height. Let's try this one now. I have the app and I can move it to be wider and taller, but this is the smallest it's going to get. All we have to do now is create different kinds of layouts. We are already calling them, so inside of these two methods, we have to create all of the layouts that we are going to use, or well, the two layouts that we want to use. For this small layout, I want to have self.frame, which is going to be TTK and frame. The parent here, or the master, is going to be self. Inside of that, I want to create 4 labels, and to save you watching me type, I'm going to copy paste things into here, like so. We have TTK labels 4 times. They all have self.frame as the parent. Then I'm setting the text to be label 1. They all have a different kind of background. And afterwards, right away, I'm calling the pack method. For the pack method, all I'm really doing is I'm setting expand to true, fill to both, and then I'm giving them some padding. There's literally nothing complicated going on right now. The last thing that we have to do in here is self.frame and pack this entire frame. For that, I want to set expand to true, and I want to set fill to both. And now if I run this, we can't see any kind of layout. And this is a little bit weird because we are creating a layout here and we're also placing it on the window. So this should be working. Now, if I scroll down a tiny bit, we are calling this method inside of this line. The problem is, if I add a print statement in here, let me call it test, I run this again, nothing happens. Which means that this method here isn't being called. And that's the problem right now. The reason why it is not being called is because of this self.window update. If I comment this one out, run this again, now we can see our app. Basically, this self.window update causes this self.configure not to run. I'm not exactly sure about the reason why, but we can overcome it quite easily by moving this configure before the Windows update. Now if I run this, there we go. This configure is run before the update. As a consequence, it runs when we are starting the app. And with that, we can see our layout. With that, I can minimize size notifier, and now we can start working on the other layout. For the medium layout, I do need quite a few lines of code. I think the best way for this is to simply copy paste everything, like so, and then let me explain it really quick. We are, once again, creating a frame, although this frame has a grid layout, which means we need a column configure and a row configure. In this case, we have 2 columns and 2 rows. After that, we are packing the frame on the main layout so we can see it. And after that, I am creating 4 different labels. These labels have the same arguments that I used up here for the minimum layout. And here you can see a minor problem in tkinter. And that is, well, we have to create all of these widgets again. There's no efficient way to copy widgets from one master to another. Right now, we have a very simple layout, so this isn't too much of a problem, but if you had a more complex layout, this would be quite a bit of work. So, well, it's quite unfortunate, but we have to work with it. Other than that, we are using the grid layout method 4 times to place each label inside of one cell. I'm also adding some padding, but well, that isn't very much. And with that, let's try the entire thing. I have the small layout, and if I increase the size of the app, we get something very strange. Also, a key error, and well, we have to cover a couple of things here. The first one, let me close this and get rid of the error message. The first problem we have is that once we create the medium layout, we are not discarding the small layout. That is quite an easy thing to fix. All I want to do for that is create self.frame as an attribute in the init method. This is going to be ttk.frame as well, with self as the master. This self.frame I want to pack right away. Self.frame.pack. We can set it to expand being true and fill being both as well. Although this one doesn't matter very much, because as soon as I create either the small or the medium layout, I want self.frame.pack _ forget. This I want to do for both the small and the medium layout. Essentially what is going to happen, when we are starting the app, we are creating a frame. By default, this frame is going to be empty. However, once we are creating the small layout, we are removing this frame and then creating a new frame for the same variable, or well, attribute. This is important because if we now create a medium layout, we can use the same attribute to forget the current layout and then create a new one. That way, if we go back to a small layout, like this one here, we can once again forget the layout and create a new one. With that, we should be making some progress, although still not ideal. So now, if I increase the size, we get something very briefly like so, but we're getting a key error none. This problem happens down here in the size notifier, more specifically, all the way down here. There's some kind of problem with self.currentSize. Let's print it actually. I want to print self.currentMinimumSize. Now if I run this, by default, we get 300. That's a good start. But if I resize the app, we get something really strange. We basically have an infinite loop. Let me close all of this. We had some kind of infinite loop where we kept on getting 300 and 600. And the issue here is, let me find it really quick. This window.bind is being run whenever any kind of widget changes size or position. As a consequence, this is also going to be run when we are placing ttk.label. Also, this is going to be run on self.frame. The reason why this is a problem is because all of these labels here, all of these labels and this frame as well, they also get the configure event. And since they can change the size, we basically end up with the problem that these widgets here, or more specifically the grid layout method, changes the size. As a consequence of this change in size, we are calling checkSize, which in turn, once again, calls this function here, which once again calls the grid method. The result is we are creating an infinite loop where nothing is going to work anymore. And Tkinter gets really confused. Fortunately, this is really easy to fix. Inside of checkSize, I want to add one more if statement. This if statement is going to be the event.widget should be self.window. I only care about this event. And only if that is the case, I want to run all of this. Now if I run the code again, I can resize the window. And now this is working perfectly fine. And we can change between different layouts. This is looking good. And with that, we are done. We have different kinds of layout and, well, we can move between them. Although I would really recommend you to go over this in your own time. Especially this kind of logic here can get a bit tricky. But, well, the exercise is going to be, I want you guys to create a third layout where all of the widgets are next to each other. For that purpose, I use grid, but you could use whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. And this layout should appear once the window is wider than 1200 pixels. Pause the video now and try to implement this yourself. Alrighty, first of all, we are going to need another layout method. I'm going to call this one create large layout, and we need self as always. And here, once again, this is going to be quite a bit of typing. So I'm going to just copy it from my notes. It's going to look like this, and it's fairly similar compared to create the medium layout. We are forgetting the previous frame, then we are creating a new frame with a column and a row, although now we have 4 different columns and just 1 row. This frame we're packing right away, and after that we're creating 4 labels. that all, once again, have the same arguments. After that, we're using the grid layout method to place all of these labels. Although now we're using column 0, 1, 2, and 3, and row is always going to be 0. Now we have to figure out when to call this. And for that, I want to minimize all of these methods so things are a bit easier to see. When we are calling size notifier, we are passing in a dictionary. It's probably better to put this dictionary over multiple lines, like so. That way it's quite a bit easier to read. To this, I want to add another entry. 1200, that's the minimum width, and I want to create large layout. And with that, we are done. I can now run this. I have a small layout, I have a medium layout, and I get a large layout. That's basically all we need. I guess what you could do, if you have your own app, you could simply use the size notifier and use it for your own purposes. This one is quite reusable and it works really well.